It now gives me great pleasure to hand the meeting over to Carla R, who is kindly agreed to come and share with us for about 40 to 45 minutes on step 7. Thank you, Carla.
Hi, everybody. My name's Carla, and I'm an alcoholic. And I want to start by thanking Chanel for the invitation to come out and share with you guys today. It's been a while since I've been on this meeting, and I see some people I dearly love and know here on this call today. And it's nice to see you. And we were talking earlier and making jokes, but it really is kind of true that, you can really, the 7th step is about, okay, I'm tired of this. I want to be different. Now I'm going to practice. Okay, bye. But there's more than that. I'm going to try to put some skin on what that has looked like for me, since I've gotten sober, and even a little before that. I mean, I don't believe that, I became a human being when I got sober. I certainly acted like a better human being when I got sober, but I was alive and in existence before. Anyway, my sobriety date, September 25th, 1987. And my home group is the Shoulder to Shoulder online workshop here out of Tahunga. Tuesday night, we have a big book and 12 and 12 step study, and Wednesday night is a history and traditions and concept study. And we started during the pandemic and saw no reason really to dismantle it. So far, so good. So humbly asked him to remove all these defects of character. Now, first we might take exception to him. What do we mean, him? Some of us had arguments with what the big book says, how the big book describes God, and, and all the pronouns and everything that they use. And of course, our 2nd step says we don't have to worry about any of that. I've never been called on to define or comprehend the power that we call God, but back then, him was a kind of an effective word. That was the word of the day, the pronoun of the day. And so humbly asked him to remove all these defects of character, hopefully these coping mechanisms that have been revealed in my first inventory, and then as I go and continue to practice these principles in the 10th step, it's always going to come up. How fear has driven me to behave or not behave in a way that is effective or not effective. And, some of the bigger ones, I'll tell you, just yesterday, my husband and I we're both kind of hard of hearing, and we live together. We spend a lot of time together, and most of the time we have a really good time. We really like each other. We've been married for 14 years and together for 16, and we like about 93% of each other, and then so we've got the other 7% to deal with, and that's pretty good odds, I think, when you're living with another human being. And our home is small, and it has never been a real problem until it becomes one, until one of us decides that we have a problem. And yesterday I decided that we were going to have a problem. And that was, like I said, we're hard of hearing, and it makes it worse at any given time if one of us has our earplugs in listening to a book or a phone call or something like that. So that means that the other person has to say something, sometimes 2 or 3 times before the other one hears that somebody's trying to say something, and then decides that we want to pay attention to the other. And then the 3rd time is we're actually going to respond. And yesterday, I just decided I got tired of it. After 16 years of being together, all of a sudden it's a problem. And I said, did you not hear me talk? Well, no, I said, do you have a book in your ear? He said, no. And I said, well, why didn't you respond to what I said? And he said, and he said, well, I didn't want to. And I said, you did not want to? And he said, no. I said, well, that's just rude. And now, and so far I'm right. And I'm on the good foot here. I've got the moral high ground, I'm sure. And he says, No, I just didn't think it. I figured you're just talking and it didn't require a response. And I'm really trying to figure out this word. He's playing Scrabble online. And so he has to have the big world shaking decision as to whether or not he's going to stop and look at his wife, who has something very important to say, probably about the dog or something I just saw on TV. But now it's very important. And I said, and so we were done with that, and I walked away thinking, important. Now this is just, the magic magnifying mind, which is not alcoholic by any stretch. It's all of us suffering from the pains of growing up, but all of a sudden I've decided this is a problem. And how, do we need counseling because he decided that his wife was less important than a game of Scrabble, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger in my mind. And then I want to retaliate. So now I'm putting all my energy into ignoring him long enough for him to notice, so that he will know then that I'm ignoring him. So now I have to get his attention to show him that I'm ignoring him. And that requires even more energy. And doesn't it talk about in our inventory, the hours that we squander on these little tiny resentments, not even big ones. And I've had some big ones, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But I'm just talking about, as we grow up, there's always going to be a seventh step in my life. There's always going to be a rubber hits the road, make the decision as to how far I want to go with some behavior or attitude. And because I know how to behave pretty well, but mine is the head that I walk around with. And this is the crux of the matter, right? These decisions that I make, how much time am I going to spend on this? And so I decided, well, I don't want to divorce him. And, what does it look like when I'm doing it? There are times that I'm playing a game and I don't want to be interrupted. And it's just like that. Maybe it does sound rude. Maybe I should make the decision that my husband is way more important than, if you put it in that context. Maybe maybe his wife is way more important than a game of Scrabble. But then when you consider that we spend probably 20 hours a day with each other all the time, that in that context, like, Jesus, can we give it a break? How can I miss you if you won't go away? So it's, and in our 4-step inventory, doesn't it ask us to begin to see things from an entirely different angle? And, it's been said that alcoholism is a disease of perception, but I just believe being a human being is a matter of perception. It's all in how I'm going to look at something, all. And I may receive something initially in a certain way, but then I have a choice as to how I'm going to choose to look at it. And when the book says our troubles are of our own making, I believe this is what he means when he says that. It's not what happened to me. I can't solicit child molestation. I can't solicit necessarily violence into my life, sexual assault or anything like that. I did not solicit. I did not make that happen. But what I do with it is my choice. And by the time I've gotten to step 7, I've learned some of that. And so I can't talk about just one step without giving some background, and it's certainly not for 45 minutes. There's a context here too. And that's, when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was 29 years old. I weighed 110 pounds. I felt like if you blew on me, I'd turn to dust. I had an almost 10-year-old daughter who I had drugged through the mill. I had walked off sat on a bar stool one day on my way to work when she was almost 4 years old, and I didn't go back for 4.5 years. And I lived a life of violence, and the way that I dealt with things, my coping mechanisms were a little out of balance. Even though at some point, they may have worked for me. I grew up in a home that was pretty violent. My parents dealt with things violently. My siblings, we all dealt with each other violently, and our parents, and I was the loudmouth, and I left home at an early age, and I still believe it was for me to leave home. I ended up in a lot of different lockups and foster homes and rehab and psychiatric hospital and all of that stuff. But all these years later, looking back, I feel like I was very fortunate to have that happen. Just simply because my 17-year-old sister committed suicide at that time, and my baby brother died of drug addiction and alcoholism, and he had spent most of his 20s in prison for violent crimes. And my last remaining sibling lives in Wisconsin, and when she's not drinking, she's on the Vicodin maintenance diet. And so somewhere along the line, I received some help and information, even though I didn't necessarily want it, and maybe they didn't deal with me in a way that I liked. At the psychiatric hospital, they medicated me to, for Thorazine, Mellaril, Valium, Dalmane sleepers, all of that kind of thing, looking for that, how are we going to fix Carla? And even I wondered that, and so by the time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had a lot of different coping mechanisms, including, I knew how to get along in the world. I could use my body. I could sell my body. I could, have some transactional relationships, which are required if you're living out on the street. It becomes pretty transactional and violent. And I had gotten a boyfriend who, and which was ironic because I grew up in the 60s, and I loved that idea of peace and love and all of that stuff, right? I loved the strength that they had of those hippies that stood out there marching on Washington and in San Francisco, carrying signs and saying no and sticking up for themselves and for the people who didn't have a voice. And yet, everything about me and my personal life was violent and destructive and self-destructive even. So when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I knew a lot of this stuff about me. I knew that I had been living in a way that I didn't want to live, and yet it was the only way I knew how. I knew when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous that I wanted to live without controlling my daughter by hitting her, and yet when the rubber hit the road, I would still do it for a little while, even though I wanted to change. And maybe that's my message here too today, is that even when we want to change, it can sometimes be difficult, because getting to the point where I say, here's my problem, this is what I want to change. And then in that, just like when we get sober and you take away our alcohol, we become restless, irritable, and discontented. Same thing when I have to make a change with anything else. When you take that away, you remove that coping mechanism, and I become restless, irritable, and discontented again until I can find the sufficient substitute for that old, unreliable, faulty dependency that no longer works. If it ever did, it certainly may have seemed that way. And that's not alcoholism, that's the human condition. However, I treated my human condition with alcohol until I couldn't anymore. And I just like to say this too, when I got here, I was one of those people who said, alcohol worked for me for such a long time, and I know that lots of people have said that, but I don't remember anybody else saying that about me. Give her another drink, it works for her. It felt like it did for me, but nobody else thought that. And the same with my unskilled coping mechanisms, even still with these defects of character, if you will, all based on fear. When I learned here, I had to come here to find out that I become selfish when I'm afraid. I become self-seeking when I'm afraid. I become dishonest when I'm afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of losing something I don't want to lose, or is something that brings me comfort or security or some sense of certainty. I don't want to lose that. Or if I'm not getting something that I think I should have, like your approval. And isn't that funny how a lot of us come in here going, I don't care what anybody thinks, so what do you think about that? I always thought that was really ironic. And I couldn't even see that in myself until I saw it in you. And isn't that great that we have this fellowship to reflect back to each other our own foibles? And if we're lucky, we become soft enough and willing enough to try these steps repeatedly, as Father Dowling said in the sixth step, in the essay on the sixth step. We're going to try these steps repeatedly. Anybody who's walking around saying, oh, these defects of character have been removed, are fooling ourselves. I just, because I can, and I might be so much better 37 years later. I have learned to trust this process. And even if it's painful, and even if I'm really, really tempted to start some gossip about somebody else so that I can feel superior for however long that is, it's a faulty dependency. It's not going to last. We know that. And part of this process of getting to this seventh step is finding out all the ways that it doesn't work. So that means I've had to make all these mistakes to get to this point where everybody else may have been sick of it long before I saw it and did it, but now I'm sick of it and I want to change. And then even after I decide I want to change, it's going to be hard sometimes. First of all, I have to recognize that's what I'm doing. And because I practice the 10th and 11th steps every day, that self-examination, prayer and meditation, creating this unshakable foundation for living, I'm on the watch for these ways of being selfish, self-seeking, and dishonest, based on fear, and I can feel it rising up in my solar plexus when I'm tempted now. A lot of times I don't have to actually behave that way, but I can feel the temptation to be rude to somebody, or to lie about something, or to talk about somebody behind their back, or to say something that just gives a little bit of a push, to have somebody get on my side. So I can feel the sense of power in that. And isn't that still what it's all about? Power, right? That faulty dependency to give me some weird sense of power. And there's only one real, true, sustainable power, and that's this life force, or God, if you will. And even in that, we can be fooled by, who's doing it right, who's got the right God, and we have to go through all of that kind of stuff. We get to AA, who's doing it right, who's in the right home group, who's got the right sponsor, and so we can't get away from it, and that's okay. That's, but I do have to recognize that that's what's going on here. I'm in the middle of it, and I've learned a little bit over time. And I was just saying this last night. So it's really, clear in my life right now that any troubles that I've had in coming to recognize what's in the way, how I'm in my own way, I always swear that after it's over and I see, oh God, it was just that. I swear that next time I have trouble, I'm gonna have a little more fun. I'm gonna relax a little bit and go through it having a little bit more fun. And that's how I've come to trust the process. Is now I jump into the pool. I know I'm gonna make mistakes. I know I'm gonna do it, but I'm willing to jump into the pool now. And I used to be somebody who thought, that somehow I would. When I was about, I guess I was about 13 to about 18 years sober. In that time, I had gotten this weird idea about perfectionism. And perfectionism doesn't mean you're perfect. Like you go to a job interview and say, yes, when they ask you, what's one of your biggest problems? And you go, well, I'm just too perfect. I just try too hard. I'm too detail oriented, and that sounds like it should be, some self-aggrandizing thing when it's really not. Perfectionism is just being obsessed with being perfect, and none of us ever are. But it made me very stiff and brittle in my life. And it was sort of like, if to put it simply, you feel like you have to get a tan before you go to the beach, or you have to know everything before you go to school, or you have to, like everything has to be, there's no room for learning or making mistakes. My friend Vince Yo, who's no longer with us, used to say, you can't be afraid to look bad in Alcoholics Anonymous. And isn't it wonderful that we have a receptacle here, a fellowship here where we bring the mess too. Maybe not in a meeting. We don't just sit and whine and complain, but we do bring the mess and say, hey, I'm going through this. I'm applying the principles here. And like Bill Wilson says, we're all suffering from the pains of growing up from time to time, which if I allow it, when I see these things in me, and then I notice that somebody else might be coming at me, maybe they jar me with their rudeness or something, but I recognize that so are they. They're suffering from the pains of growing up today, and maybe my ability to be compassionate can grow a little bit. Maybe my tolerance for other people's shortcomings can grow a little bit. And Bill Wilson doesn't wait till the end of the book to let us know this is what we're doing. Right up front on page 19 in our original big book, he says, we feel that a real tolerance of other people's shortcomings and a respect for their opinions make us more useful to others. And that's paraphrasing, so you have to read your own big book in that one. But you know what I mean? This is like the idea. This is the gauntlet that's laid down where the challenge for me is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And that means that I live with you now, my friend Larry Peterson used to say all the time, that whatever it was I was complaining about that you're doing isn't going to look any better on me when I'm doing it. And so the willingness to continue to recognize, my fears, my need for attention, my need for respect, or my not even a need, my perceived need, what I think I need in order to be okay, the ways that I go about trying to manage my fears by creating some kind of certainty, which becomes these little habitual habits and rituals that may be useful for a while, but when I see that they no longer serve me, then I have to relinquish that too. One of my ways was I used to just take commitments, just commit, just say yes, 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 yes. That I took that to heart when it said, that constant thought of others and how we may help meet their needs. I took that to mean that I was only ever supposed to think about everybody else. And the busier I was, the more it counted, and everything was a tally as to who's busier. And that's how the conversations were with everybody in AA. Who's busier, who's more active. That must mean that they're, and we can even get these collective narratives going. And it's fun until it isn't. It works until it doesn't. And step 7 tells me to start to recognize when I'm running into a wall. And we had this guy named Scottish John in my first home group who'd say, if you think you're beating your head against the wall, you're probably beating your head against the wall, which means I'm practicing something that no longer works. And so I learned how to say yes, yes to commitments, yes to service, but also yes to service within my home. I couldn't run away from home in order to be part of AA. I was raising a daughter, and part of learning how to, I had to make room for her in my life, and she was already in my life, but in my consciousness. Like, she wasn't just this thing that that I had to take care of. This was a whole person, and it took time. It took me to stop and see who she really was and what she was really thinking, and learning to listen. And what that looked like. I started out talking about this, but for young parents, I don't know who you are, if there's anybody in here right now, but I moved to talk about it. And that was in the beginning. I really didn't want to hit her. And we'd have these hideous arguments. And she was a big mouth like me too, when she was growing up and getting taller. And I just didn't want to have these fist fights with her. And one lady, suggested I had to hold my hands behind my back whenever we were in, whenever things were getting heated, holding my hands behind my back. And that was literal. That was literally acting my way through this. And then I said, but what if she comes at me? She said, go into the bathroom. And I'd go into the bathroom, and I said, but she bangs on the door. She said, get in the shower. And I said, but I can still hear her. And she said, then sing. And so that's what it took. So even when I really, really, really wanted to change, there were all these things, all these actions, and all this willingness that had to come up and be utilized in the moment so that I didn't give in to the old way. Change for me has been hard in some areas, even when it wasn't working, even when the old way wasn't working. And I don't know who needs to hear that. I'm not saying stop. I'm just saying that, yes, it's hard until it's not hard anymore. And all through the big book, it doesn't, these promises that we read about walking on the broad highway, hand in hand and shoulder to shoulder with each other. Yes, that happens if we're willing to do some work. We can have this if we're willing, and it says that all through the book. It doesn't say, oh yeah, just with, it's just going to be gravy now. Just join us and we'll all be fine. No, that's what the tools of the inventory are. That's what digging this stuff up. In the essay on the 8th step, I believe in the 12 and 12, he says, is this a necessary piece of surgery that we're doing? Well, yeah, if I want a new life. All these years later, I have to tell you, my daughter's 47 years old now. And it took from the time she was 11 till she was 23 for us to write this relationship. And there was a lot of work that went into it. And there were a lot of unpleasant times, along with all of the hope and all of the good stuff that happened. When she was 16, she came home and she was pregnant. When she was 11, I had to put her into treatment, and she was there for 6 months. And when she was 16, she came home and she told me she was pregnant, and I got to walk with her through that. I didn't have to throw her away. I got to be the new person who I was by the time she was 16. I got to say, I'm here, whatever you decide, I am here. And we walked through that together. And I got to be present at the birth of my first grandson, who just turned 30, by the way, and he's been practicing law now for a couple of years. And then I have another grandson who's 23, and he's a good young man as well. And she's a mother that she's just the best mother. And I know that some of that happened. I know that some of the most valuable things I learned to say to my daughter, because some of it because I wished it would have happened when I was a child, but I learned these words later, and that was to tell my child sometimes I was wrong about that. The most valuable words to say to a child, that somehow, and maybe it was even generational or cultural at one time. Sometimes that collective consciousness is like that. But to tell their children they were wrong used to be a no-no for parents. And I learned to say that to my daughter, and that gave us a working relationship. It softened the edges so that we could come together. And I mean, she's the director of the outpatient services for a psychiatric hospital now. So I like to take a little credit for her training there, but not really. But she's a fantastic human being. And I don't know if she is because or in spite of me, but because of Alcoholics Anonymous, I get to be a witness to this and a participant in my life. If I'm willing to go ahead with all my imperfections and the things I've learned, who I am today, just to be willing to jump into the pool and swim in the tide of humanity. And even in this, noticing what happens along the way. Whatever I'm doing right now is the work that I'm doing. There's never not something that's here to wake me up. I don't believe God shows up. We wake up. And to the grace that has always been available. And now I get to, this step 7, if you will, is the continued recognition and then relinquishment of the old ways for the new. And to use the old, maybe worn out, but still valid analogy of the chrysalis and the butterfly, we're going to have many, many, many of those. And a lot of the time when I'm going through a change, it feels a lot like, what the, and I imagine the caterpillar going through that, like, what the, and then they become this mushy chrysalis, and then all of a sudden one day they're ready to fly. But it's a process. And I don't like being in the middle of still, although I trust it more, but I don't like being vulnerable. I don't like having people see me imperfect. I don't like feeling like a defensive, and I don't like feeling crusty. But somehow it seems like it's sort of a requirement and the rite of passage. I don't know why we call steps, why people, I don't, but I don't know why I hear that people call step 6 and 7 the forgotten steps, because they permeate, they are the crux and the leverage of everything I do every day. And I heard it put so well a couple months ago, and that is step 10 tells me how I'm doing with step 6 and 7, kind of watching myself and seeing how I did. And as frightened as I might be of these changes, and who am I going to be if I don't have this, particular edge to my personality, or, these defenses that I have. I mean, one of them used to be, we all know that old saying of, if you love something, set it free, and if it belongs to you, it'll come back. And the way that I used to treat people was, if you love something, push it off a cliff, and if it can come back from that, buddy, you are in good shape. And we'll see how that goes. But even when I have to stand up, even when I feel like I have to speak up these days, there was a time when I just stayed quiet for a while, because when I would speak up, I would be crazy, and I would give people the very ammunition that they needed to continue to call me crazy. And so I was quiet for a while until I learned the words. And then I started to speak the words again, and I was very frightened. I mean, I'm somebody who ended up in 5-point restraints because I didn't believe in what people were doing. Now, wasn't always a really valid cause, but sometimes it was, and I didn't always know the difference. And so it took a while, but I know the difference between something, hills that I should die on. Well, mostly I know the difference between hills I should die on and things I should speak up for, and stand stubborn. And something else that this practice has brought me is that just because somebody, this is going to be, I hope you hear me in the way it's intended, but just because somebody else is upset with me doesn't always mean I was wrong. And I have to be okay with that too. I have to be okay with somebody not liking me. I learned that in sponsorship, certainly. I learned that raising kids, raising my daughter, that she doesn't have to like me in order for that to be in place either. But then to learning learning how to navigate through life and speak up for something, and especially if somebody has no voice, especially if I'm standing up for someone else, to learn how to speak up where there's some dignity, some sustainable, some principle of value in that, and be okay with the result. Be okay even when my voice shakes to go ahead and speak up, to be the outlier in a group of people who have a much different opinion, which has meant for me, in reality, it has meant sometimes changing home groups. Sometimes it has meant changing sponsors. Sometimes it has meant not being accepted in a certain group of people because I have a different idea about some of how these principles should look, and not doing it with then standing up, but without anger or retaliation or spite, but just simply standing up for the principle rather than against somebody or something, if that makes sense. So I don't know. There's a weird crowd here because I feel like I'm talking to a lot of different people. So it's your fault. But anyway, Bill wrote a letter about the same time. It looks like this letter was written, it was published in the Grapevine later, but he wrote this letter on emotional sobriety to someone who was struggling with depression, and he talked about faulty dependencies and things that we, old coping mechanisms. And I always find it interesting that letter on emotional sobriety, the next frontier, was also written about the same time that he wrote those essays on steps 6 and 7, and that the awakening has to continue. And what has held or developed the foundation for this is the continued practice of the 11th step. Certainly with the 10th step, I do a better 11th step when I'm doing 10, but this practice of 11th step, which has introduced me to so many what I thought were new ideas, but what it really did was it wove me back together with the world at large. It wove me back together with humanity, and seeing that, yes, I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm a small part of a great whole that is AA, but AA is a small part of a great whole that is the world at large. And that there are so many more people here that I'm here to interact with. And so it took away that us and them thing for me, being an alcoholic in Alcoholics Anonymous. It actually spat me out into the big world, tethered to Alcoholics Anonymous, not separate from. So anyway, the continued practice of step 7 for me is just this, the willingness to recognize and relinquish any of these old faulty dependencies driven by fear, based on fear. I'm not so much driven by them anymore, but I can be disturbed by them. But my willingness to relinquish it for a new way, first it's a new idea and then a new practice, is it. I come to trust the process in the first 9 steps and then continue it in 10, grow it in 11, and share it in 12. And that's me. That's it. That's what it looks like. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, too scattered. I think that's enough out of me, and looking forward to questions or shares from you guys. Thanks.